use your glucose meter to reverse diabetes? You better believe you can, and today I'll show you how. But we're going to start with a sort of a complaint by someone who has beat diabetes without a glucose meter. Here's what he writes. Type 2 is a disease of insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. Your focus on glucose is like fighting the fever when you have a bacterial infection killing you, and that is a direct quote from Dr. Jason Fung. So this is a Jason Fung fan, and I am a Jason Fung fan myself. I appreciate Dr. Fung. He says, I applied what he said, lost 122 pounds in 11 months, and completely reversed my diabetes, and I didn't measure glucose once. So what he's saying is you talk and talk about the glucose meter, and you call him Mike the meter, and you say we ought to be testing our glucose. Hey, I read a book from Dr. Fung, applied what he said, reversed my diabetes, lost over 100 pounds, didn't need a glucose meter. Well, first of all, let me say congratulations. You've done very, very well. And however you get there, you seem to have achieved what you set out to achieve, which is reversing diabetes and losing weight. So congratulations on that. But I don't believe that attitude is quite the perfect attitude, let's say. Let's start with this. Most people, when they get diagnosed as diabetics, know almost nothing about diabetes, insulin resistance, carbohydrates, what a diabetic should eat, what he should not eat. They just don't know anything. And that's one of the reasons diabetes is so scary when you're told you have it, because you don't know a thing. All you know is it's bad. And you might get your leg cut off and have all kinds of issues and die young and so forth and so on. So you know it's bad, but that's about all they know. And so one of the most common things that gets typed into the YouTube search box and the Google search box is, what should a diabetic eat? People are wanting to know. They sort of instinctively realize that diabetics need to change their diet a little bit. This guy says, hey, I didn't need to test my glucose. I read Dr. Fung's book and changed my lifestyle, changed my diet, went to low-carb and intermittent fasting, reversed my diabetes, lost over 100 pounds. Glucose meter, schlucose meter, I didn't need it. Well, I will say this, good for you, but in most people's case, that's probably not going to be good enough. People don't have a clue about what to do when they get diagnosed. And yes, we could toss a Dr. Jason Fung book into their laps or a Dr. Richard Bernstein book into their laps and say, read this and all will be well. But for most people, that wouldn't be enough. This guy is an exception. This guy is unusual, that he can read one book, figure out what to do, be motivated to do it, and bam, it works beautifully. Most people are going to need more than that. So I just jotted down a few notes here. Let me just share some of them. What does a glucose meter do for you? Well, it shares a window into your body. It provides you a glimpse of what's going on metabolically when you eat food. Again, most people have no idea what's going on. Is there any difference going on in my body between when I eat a little Debbie snack cake versus a piece of celery? Is there a difference? Some may say, well, I feel better eating the snack cake, the sugary snack cake, than I do eating the celery. But the issue is not what do you feel. And that's the beauty of the glucose meter. It's not going to be concerned with how do you feel. You're not going to test your blood sugar and see the glucose meter say, well, you're feeling fine today. It's going to give you a cold, hard number. And the font isn't even going to be that fancy. Whether it's a 98, a 120, a 150, a 250, a 400, it's going to give you a number. But that number is powerful because it's going to tell you what's going on in your body currently. The glucose meter is not about what you've been doing in the last 3 months like an A1C. The glucose meter is what's going on right now in your blood sugar meter and or in your blood sugar. And we know, you don't have to be very knowledgeable to understand that high numbers are bad. So if you test your blood sugar and you get a 250, that's not good. Normal numbers like 100, 110, 120, 88. Those are good numbers. We understand that much. The question, of course, is there a relationship between the food you put in your mouth and the numbers that show up on your glucose meter? And the answer is yes, a big, fat yes. And one of the big reasons for using a glucose meter is to give you the motivation you would not normally have. There's a lot of people that sort of know what to do, but they have a hard time being motivated. And some are sort of semi-believers. They hear people like me and Dr. Fung and Dr. Barry, different ones, say you really need to cut those carbs. And they're like, yeah, I guess that might be right, but I don't know about that. And so as long as they're in that I don't know about that stage, they're never going to be super motivated. But it's amazing how motivated you can be when you use a glucose meter and it gives you those cold, hard numbers and tells you what's going on with your body. And it's especially motivating when you notice that certain types of food send your blood sugar to the races and jack it up way high, and others, it doesn't move much at all. And when you see that, it's like a little light bulb goes on over your head, and suddenly motivation appears out of nowhere. It's like you just got zapped with instant motivation. Now, I interviewed a man named Bill Burliant a while back, and he gave such a beautiful, beautiful testimony of how he beat diabetes, and the meter had so much to say about how he changed his diet. It was tremendously important in his beating diabetes. We're not going to go to the whole interview, but let me just share a short clip of Bill telling how he first used a glucose meter to figure out that some things worked better than others. Some foods worked better than others in terms of keeping his glucose in check.
But this preacher came on. Okay, Dennis Pollock. Who's Dennis Pollock? I don't know Dennis Pollock. Okay, so I decided I'd watch one of your videos. I watched your video. Your video was one on eating hamburgers. So you ate a hamburger, and then an hour after you ate it, you took your blood sugar, and the blood sugar hadn't hardly gone up at all. I thought, well, that's strange. He's eating food, but the blood sugar meter, Mike the meter, didn't go up. And then you ate a hamburger for dinner, and then it didn't go up. So I said, well, this doesn't sound kosher to me. It doesn't sound legit. So I tell you what, I'm going to go get some hamburger, and I'm going to prove that Dennis Pollock is wrong. And then I'm going to write to the preacher and say, no, this doesn't work. So it was 9:30 at night, something like that. Stores were open till 10 o'clock. I ran out and I got a big box of frozen hamburgers. My wife, Ann, thought, you've lost your mind. You're crazy. So the next morning, I took my blood sugar. It was about 271, 272. I had a hamburger for breakfast. Well, then I was hungry. So I had a hamburger at about 10:30, 11 o'clock. And then at 12 o'clock, I had another hamburger. And then for dinner, I had 2 hamburgers. So I ate 5 hamburgers that day.
Yeah, without any buns.
No bun. Yeah,
right.
No bun. Just the, and these were giant hamburgers. I mean, these were not McDonald's hamburgers. They were about this thick, and they were big. I don't know how much, if they were 6 ounces or 8 ounces or what, but it was a huge hamburger. So I ate 5 of those. So the next morning I took my blood sugar. It was 240. I said, what in the world? I ate all this hamburger. I expected my blood sugar to go up, and my blood sugar went down 30 points in one day. So I said, I'm going to watch some more of his videos. So I spent the rest of the day watching your videos.
So this is what we're talking about here. It's called a glucose meter, and it will tell you what's going on in your blood right now. And it's amazing how this can motivate people to change their diet and change their ways. Ideally, it would be perfect if you could read one book or listen to one YouTube video by Dennis Pollock or whoever and figure out that I need to cut my carbs way down and do time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting, whatever you like to call it. Ideally, that would be great, but for most people, it just doesn't work. But this will do it for so many people. This one guy didn't need it. Most people will. Now, let's talk a little bit about glucose spikes. The diet that I recommend is a low spike diet. You don't let your spikes go very high after you eat. Now, of course, your blood sugar is going to rise, but it doesn't have to rise way high. It can just rise gently and then come gently back down. So if you eat a meal and your blood sugar rises up to 180, 200, 220, I call that a spike if you were down at 100 before, depending on where you were to start with. And what I discovered was certain foods spike my glucose, certain ones don't. And guess what? I started making a list in my mind. I don't know that I ever made it on paper, but in my own mind, I started making a list of meals that worked for me. You might call them Mike-approved meals. How did I know that? Well, I would test my blood sugar before my meal, maybe get a 98, and then after the meal, about an hour to an hour and 20 minutes later, and it goes up to 118, then I'd say, well, that's not bad. 118 isn't so bad. I think I can live with that, and I've approved meal. But if I eat a meal and it jumps way up there, 150, 160, 180, 200, 220, it's like, nope, I can't do that again. So it's called a post-test. And here's the problem. Many doctors don't even talk about these things. They don't even talk about a glucose meter. Some will give you one. Or in some nations, they write a prescription for one. And so you end up with a glucose meter, but often they won't even tell you what to do with it much, except, well, test your fasting blood sugar, once or twice a week and see how it's doing. Not good enough. We need to be testing meals, especially at the beginning when you're a novice in metabolic truth. If you don't know much about how blood sugar rises and what makes it rise and what foods work well for you and which ones don't, you need to start vetting your foods, your diet, your go-to meals. We all have them. We all have certain meals we eat frequently, maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. And they're just our go-to meals, and we're going to have that. Well, find out if those meals are really your friends. If they are, if they don't raise your blood sugar much, you're in good shape. But if they raise it too much, you're not. So getting back to the comment that the man left that I shared at the beginning of this program, the idea that you don't need to test glucose, it's a waste of time, you just want to deal with insulin. Well, it's the same thing, really. If your blood sugar is spiking, you can be sure your insulin is spiking as well. And if you move toward a non-spiking diet, it's not going to spike your blood sugar all over the place. You're going to automatically lower your insulin levels. One of the troubles with spikes is that the insulin follows right after the glucose. And when the glucose starts coming down, often it will crater and come down like crazy. Your insulin will hang around for a while and just hang out in your blood. And you'll have high insulin maybe for 2 or 3 hours, whereas you only had high glucose for 30 minutes and it started coming back down. So you don't want spikes. And I don't know why it is more people don't talk about it, but really, the victory is won when you cut down on those spikes, and you got to know which foods work. You can't go by a feeling. Well, how do I feel? Do I feel like I'm spiking? No good. You've got to get a number and find out what you're doing. Now, at the beginning, you would be better to go ahead and do a pre-test before you eat and then a post-test about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes after you eat to see what the spike's involved and how much you're spiking. After a while, you may not need to do those pre-tests. You can just see where you spike, where you end up, because you'll have a pretty good idea from all that testing about where your baseline level is. And you know what's interesting? Even though Dr. Fung talks a lot about the hyperinsulinemia and high insulin, and I don't say as much, although I talk about it for sure, and if you watch enough of my videos, you'll know that I do talk about it. I'm not ignorant of that, but I do emphasize keeping the glucose in check by keeping those spikes in check. But here's what's interesting. Dr. Fung and I have come to the exact same conclusion. We're no different. He preaches low carb, I preach low carb. He preaches intermittent fasting, I call it time-restricted eating. We're exactly the same in terms of our remedy for this whole situation. It's just that he focuses on insulin and hardly says much about testing your glucose, and I talk about testing your glucose all the time. So we came by two different paths, but we arrived at the same destination. Lower the carbs, practice intermittent fasting / time-restricted eating. So, Dr. Fung fans, don't get too upset with me. I preach the same message as he does, and I respect him tremendously. He's a smart guy, and he's come to some good conclusions. The same conclusions I came, mostly from looking at this little guy. So he did the studies, and I imagine he read a number of books and thought about it and theorized and figured some things out, and now he's like the number one top guy in this area. And little Dennis, he didn't have much going on, but he had a glucose meter. And I read a couple of decent books, Dr. Bernstein's and Dr. Atkins and one or two others. And I came to the exact same conclusion as Dr. Fung has. So don't criticize me too much, okay? And I replied to this man when he said I didn't need to test my glucose. I said, for every person like you that can just read a single book and get victory, there's probably a dozen that it'll take more than that. You will need to look at this little machine, this little mini computer, and see some numbers and figure a few things out. So begin to test your blood sugar. Do the post-meal tests. Now, granted, you're looking for your peaks, and they can be different depending on what you eat. So if you eat a high-carb meal, like a potato and maybe a big piece of bread, your blood sugar is going to go up fast, it's going to come down pretty fast. So you may peak at an hour. But if you eat a lower carb meal with quite a bit of fat, it may be an hour and a half before you hit your peak. So that even has its effect. But start making a list. This food works for me. This doesn't. This food is my friend. This one is not. And as the spikes start to come down, and you rarely see yourself going above 140, and after a while you get so fanatical like me, you don't even like to see it at 130. And then there can come a time where you don't even like to see it in the 1-teens. That's on you. That's your job to decide how far you want to let your glucose go and which kind of food you want to eat. But definitely try to keep those glucose peaks from 140 or higher, for sure. Now, another reason to use your glucose meter and do these post-meal tests, and I can't say it enough, post-meal tests, not just fasting glucose, not just random tests. Well, I wonder what my blood sugar is now. No good. Post-meal. Find out which meals work for you. And another reason why I still do it, I mean, there's really two reasons why I still test my glucose meter, test my blood with a glucose meter. One is, of course, for your sake. And we do tests just to demonstrate certain things. But there is another reason. And the other reason is there are sometimes I try new foods. Maybe it's a new keto product or some new combination of foods that I haven't tried in a while or maybe never have. And I'm curious. They're a little bit iffy. And I'm wondering, well, how do I stand with this? And if I don't spike too high when I should be hitting my peak, then I'm good. If I spike too high, then I'm not good. And it's like, that just doesn't work for me. I won't be doing that again. And let me say this, I think it's good to have a little bit of healthy cynicism. That's right, even be cynical with this guy, with me. And you're saying, well, what he's saying sounds like it may be right, sounds like it makes a little sense, but I'm not sure. And so anytime you're not sure about what people are saying, whether it's some high-carb guru, low-fat guru, or anybody else, the proper response is, let me check with Mike. Let me check with my glucose meter and see what he has to say. And if Mike says it's good, it's good. Hyperinsulinemia is an issue for sure. But if you keep your spikes down, you automatically will be keeping your insulin down. And so the ultimate solution, whether you talk insulin, or glucose, keeping glucose low, one way or the other, it's a low spike, low carb diet that involves time-restricted eating. about 2 meals per day, separated by 6 hours with no snacks in between. You do that, and you keep your spikes down, and your insulin is going to be down as well.